Let's talk now to a legal expert, Ulrich Roux, who joins us for more on this story. Mr. Roux, good evening to you, and thank you as always for talking to us. The NPA, it was scheduled, and I'm talking in the past tense because we've just seen a communique postponing a media briefing that was to be addressed tomorrow around Mr. Omotoso, and the understanding is that there would have been a possible appeal that would be announced as part of that. Question is, can the NPA detain Mr. Omotoso whilst they try to process an appeal against him?
Hi, good evening, Lolly. Thank you for having me. No, theoretically speaking, they cannot. You cannot detain a person once they've been acquitted and released from custody, as is the case here. He spent 8 years in custody and was then acquitted on the 2nd of April this year and accordingly released. But he has now been arrested on charges of contravening the immigration laws of South Africa, with the Department of Home Affairs alleging that he is illegal in the country and that his application to have his status repaired or rectified has been revoked by the Minister of Home Affairs. So according to that contravention, and if he is indeed in contravention of the immigration laws and is regarded as a prohibited person in South Africa, he could be detained and should not be released on bail, given that he has no status in South Africa. Now, the argument behind that is that a person can only be released on bail if their status in the country is rectified. In other words, they are a legal person in the country and they have a fixed address to where they will be residing pending the finalization of the criminal charge against him. So theoretically speaking, he should not be released until his status is rectified. Of course, if it cannot be rectified, then he should be deported. Now, what I can presume the NPA is attempting to do is to immediately lodge the appeal. They have 21 days within which the judgment was handed down, 21 court days, that is, in order to lodge their application for leave to appeal, and they should be lodging it during the course of next week. He should remain in custody until that application for leave to appeal is launched, and then they can bring a special application in which they request that he not be released on bail and he also not be deported pending the finalization of the appeal. Of course, if he is deported and deported back to Nigeria, it would be difficult to prosecute the appeal given that he is no longer in South Africa and he is not a legal citizen in South Africa. He's thus prohibited from returning to the country. So one would have to wait and see, when they file the application for leave to appeal his acquittal. And if they do then lodge a special application in order to keep him in custody pending the finalization of the appeal.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's actually the question that you have just answered, the second part of my question, but I'd like for you to just crystallize it, if you may. What will the appeal decision mean for his deportation?
Well, that's why they would have to launch the special application to keep him in custody pending the finalization of the appeal, given that he is a prohibited person in the country. So, all things fair and equal, he should be deported. He's no longer able to reside in the country and then would have to spend a minimum period of 5 years outside of South Africa, upon which he can then appeal to have his prohibited person status revoked. So that is a 5-year minimum period that he will not be allowed back into the country. But of course, the NPA will be arguing that their appeal must first be finalized before he is deported out of the country. Because if the appeal is successful and indeed he is then convicted, he would then, of course, be serving a period of imprisonment as a sentence. And the National Prosecuting Authority would want him to remain in South Africa in order to serve that period of imprisonment. Now, this is, of course, an impairment of a person's freedom, which is a constitutional right of anyone in South Africa. So the NPA would have to really launch an application that has very strong merits should they wish to succeed with it. It is certainly quite not a very common application that they would have to launch in order to keep him in custody pending the finalization of this appeal.
And you've referred to it as a special application.
Yes, definitely. Again, they would have to say, well, we have strong merits in our application for leave to appeal succeeding. So in other words, we have a strong belief that it will succeed. And should it succeed, he could face a period of imprisonment accordingly, because he is an unlawful person and a prohibited person in the country pertaining to his status. He should be remanded in custody pending the finalization of this appeal. It's not a very common application, as I've said before, and they would really have to argue strong merits that they do believe that an appeal will be successful. Yeah. Remember that he's already spent 8 years in prison pending the finalization of the trial where he was acquitted in the Port Elizabeth High Court. So, one would have to wait and see what their grounds of appeal are and why they believe they have a strong chance of success in it.
We already have a reference point in the name of Shepherd Bushiri. He skipped the country. His case is slightly different, but there's difficulty now for law enforcement to try and bring him back in order to answer to the alleged crimes against him. How difficult an exercise would this be if the NPA were not to succeed in stopping him from being deported?
Well, they would then have to go through the normal channels of bringing an extradition application whereby he is extradited from Nigeria to South Africa in order to face the criminal charges here. But there are a number of steps that will have to be followed prior to that happening. They first have to launch their application for leave to appeal now. Now, should that application be successful, they would then either appeal to a full bench of the High Court, so in other words, a bench comprising of a minimum of 3 judges, or they could appeal to the Supreme Court of Appeal in Bloemfontein. If their application for leave to appeal is not successful, they would then have to petition the Supreme Court of Appeal in Bloemfontein in order for their appeal to be heard. So there's a number of legal processes that still need to take place before one can even consider whether this appeal will be heard or not. And I think that we must remember, very different to Shepherd Bushiri, is that Omotoso stood trial. There was evidence-led. He presented his case and the state presented their case, and the judge found that there's no way that he can be convicted of the charges leveled against him. The judge was very scathing pertaining to the NPA's behavior during that trial and the quality of the cross-examination during the trial. And remember that an appeal is based solely on the record of what transpired in the trial court. So, certainly if one has to look at what has transpired during that trial, the chances of success on the face of it, of an appeal on behalf of the NPA, are not very good, in my opinion. And that is why they would have to bring a very strong application to keep him in custody pending the finalization of this appeal process. What we must remember is that he is illegal in the country, according to the Department of Home Affairs. He is a prohibited person, and accordingly, he will remain in custody. So the NPA will have to get their ducks in a row very quickly in order to prosecute that appeal and in order to abide by the timelines and to avoid him being deported prior to them even launching their appeal.
Yeah. Ulrich Roux, thank you very much for explaining to us so well. Very clear. It is in the interest of the NPA to have Timothy Omotoso in South Africa, if indeed they do intend to appeal that court judgment, which essentially cleared him of these charges. Thank you very much for your time, legal expert there.